Good afternoon. Good afternoon, my dear friends. Thank you. Thank you for the support. Today I'm going to talk about a topic which is not easy to talk about. I'm going to talk about water. Coincidentally, it's a resource that the country that I'm based in, Singapore, has always treated water as a very interesting, because it is a resource that we often struggle with. We no longer struggle like we used to, in a sense that we are a little bit more self-sufficient now when it comes to water. But Singapore is one of the I think according to the United Nations, we are in the top 40 or top 50 most water-stressed locations or countries. So today the focus is on water footprints in tourism. But we're not going to talk about Singapore. We're going to talk about whether this is an equitable question. We're going to talk about the water footprint in the tourism industry in the less developed countries, and whether that is something that could turn out to be a question of ethics, equitable discussion on equity. So I'm looking at an article on the internet. My laptop is in front of me right now. I didn't really rehearse this podcast, as you probably can feel. It's quite impromptu, like most of my podcasts. But I roughly know that I will be doing this topic and trying to take a closer look. We often talk about ethics because the tourism industry is one where we sometimes feel that it creates impacts that are not really considered fair to some people in society. It often raises the question of how certain people in society is able or not quite able to cope with the impacts that tourism brings. So water is is becoming a scarcer and scarcer resource in many parts of the world, and you may have heard or read people talking and writing about the war for water. Tourism absorbs around 1% or maybe slightly more than 1% of the global consumption of water, and I'm feeling that this number might not be that so accurate. If we take into consideration a few things like domestic tourism, if we take into consideration the indirect usage of water in tourism, then this number of 1% might be a little bit too small. There is direct and there is also indirect usage of water in tourism. The average water consumption of the average tourist is pretty high. Tourists use a lot of water, and depending on where you are and what activities you do, the level of water will definitely change. For example, if you're in a place where there are activities that lead to a slightly greater or higher level of water consumption. And if we compare water usage or water footprint in the more developed countries and that from the less developed countries, we are probably looking at a few things. The water footprint in the tourism industry in the more developed countries seem to have come down over the last 1 decade, and that is likely due to the fact that sustainability practices are now being more rampant in the tourism industry. The the number of sustainability initiatives and practices in the tourism industry is definitely more, both in the developed and the less developed countries. The second thing that we should ask is how are the less developed regions in the world coping with an increasing tourism industry, which also means that the amount of water consumption has increased. When we talk about the less developed countries, we are generally and often talking about places where sustainability practices might not be as commonplace or widespread. We are talking about places where people tend to struggle a bit more with the availability and the access to water, where technologies related to water is perhaps a bit not so high. So all this leads to the question of what must we do? What should we do when we look at the less developed parts of the world that is perhaps not really very well equipped to handle the growing tourism industry? And so this podcast, I want to focus on the less developed countries, because these are places where the competition of water between the tourists and the local communities could be fiercer. And as I said, these are places where the access and availability, especially of the local people to precious water sources, could often tend to be more challenging. And these places might not really be equipped to feed the demands in terms of water usage, the demands of a growing tourism industry. We're talking about places where the political will to impose sustainability practices are also usually or quite often weaker. We are talking about places where the access and we're talking about the access of the local people to water or to sources of water is a bit more challenging. And if we throw in climate change and the effects climate change has on water sources in the less developed countries, where the reaction or the adaptation to climate change is also generally weaker or poorer, then this all seem to add to the fact that tourism is a much more challenging industry to manage with all these different things. So I hope this 8-minute 30 seconds podcast can shed some light to your thinking about water in the tourism industry in the less developed parts of the world. I thank you for your support. It seems that more and more people are tuning into my podcast, and I thank you. Reach out to me for coffee if you're based in Singapore, or find me on LinkedIn and drop me a connection invite. See you. Thank you. Bye-bye.